can get started, as I said, my job today is to teach you a little bit or show you a couple things in terms of identifying the various crab and shrimp and fish that we may encounter. And so the first thing I like to mention is that, you know, although we are a green crab monitoring program, a green crab detection program, that's sort of our primary focus, we don't expect or we don't hope to find green crab at all. If we're lucky, they won't make it in here. And what this project really is about for me personally, what I'm most excited about is the data that we can collect on all of our native species. The vast majority of the species that I'll be talking about today are species, organisms that don't receive a lot of attention. Many of them are not commercially valuable. They occur in their sort of their key habitats are these pocket estuaries, marsh habitats that don't receive a lot of foot traffic for the most part. People don't spend a lot of time walking hand in hand and the sun's setting across a salt marsh or a mud flat. You know, some people do. My wife and I do, but we do stuff like this all the time. So what I'm excited about is the data that we can collect on all of these critters, and that's why it's very, very important that we know how to identify them so that we can start recording information about them. This information will be incredibly important if and when green crab do arrive, because we need to know how the populations of all these other critters might be affected by green crab when they arrive. There's a lot of other things that we as humans are doing to our environment as well, and it's kind of nice to know what impact we might have on these critters as things change. Okay, so I'm going to talk about crabs first because I'm a crab guy, and then I'm going to move on to shrimp, and then I'll talk a little bit about fish as well. And so I'm going to split it up that way. Our traps that we use catch a lot of crabs and a lot of fish primarily, but the surveys that we do along the shore that Emily will talk about later, we'll be looking at molts of crabs primarily. Now, for those of you who aren't entirely familiar, a crab has a hard exoskeleton, a shell, and in order to grow, it must shed that exoskeleton, that shell, through a process we call ecdysis. But what's really interesting about that is that those shells that we find on the beach or in the riprap or along the rack line of a shore, those aren't necessarily all dead crabs. Many of those are just cast off shells. We can learn a lot about the types of crabs that are in an area and the abundance of the crabs and the natural cycles of those crabs by looking at the quantity of those shells in some areas, or the diversity of shells in those areas. Okay, so let's move on to crabs. First thing I will say is, we've talked about green crab, and if you know anything about our local crabs, you know we also have a yellow shore crab, and we have a purple shore crab, and we have a red rock crab. And all of these things, the thing that's interesting is we describe things using color a lot. Forget about that. Everything you've learned about crabs and colors, we're just going to toss that out the window because color is not a really great way to identify a crab. For instance, these are all molts of crabs that you might find on the shore. And after they've been sitting for a while, they start to bleach out. And so even though these crabs might have been a much darker color at one time, they kind of all start to look alike after a while. I have trays of molts that I've put out in various places around the room. You can kind of eyeball those as we're going through this. And you'd see that, you know, the color, they all start to look an awful lot alike after a while. So let's throw color out the window. The other thing is, even in living crabs, color is pretty variable. And I'm going to show you lots of examples of that as well. So let's forget about color and let's focus on those things that don't change very much. And that requires us to know a little bit about crab morphology or the body parts of a crab. So here's your typical Dungeness crab as a line drawing. The back shell is called the carapace, and that is a very important thing for us to be looking at as we're trying to identify crabs. Along the front edge of the carapace are what we call the marginal teeth, and that pretty much is from the eyeball here out to the widest point on the shell. Between the eyes is what we call the rostrum. The rostrum on a crab is typically relatively small. On a shrimp, that rostrum can be long and pointy, if you ever caught a shrimp, you know you got to watch out for that because you can get poked with it. The eyes there, just pointing out where they are because the location of the eyes is very important for us to identify these critters. The walking legs, the size and shape of the walking legs is important. The claw, the shape of the claw, and the dentition on the claw. We call this dentition, the teeth on the claw. This says a lot about how a crab makes its living. If those are sharp and pointy, it's because it likes to get a hold of things and maybe rip them apart. If they look more like molars, it's because that crab likes to crush big shelled things, and they have to have really strong claws to do that. So I just mentioned a whole lot of really interesting body parts, and now I'm going to mention something that's really interesting. This is the mnemonic that I developed, and everybody shakes their head whenever I talk about it. Clever crabs will conquer. If you remember only one thing I say, remember this, because if you use this mnemonic, you can identify any of the crabs that I'm going to show you. So, clever crabs will conquer. That stands for carapace, claws, walking legs, and color. And if you approach identification using this in a stepwise fashion, you'll do a pretty good job of identifying the critters that I'll be showing you today. So start with the carapace, then move on to the claws, then the walking legs, and then lastly, look at the color, and that can give you some hints as well. So what is the carapace shape? That's pretty important. And when we're looking at the carapace, we like to know about the shape and the number of the marginal teeth, these little points along the front edge. We want to know about the bumps on the rostrum and how far that rostrum protrudes. We want to know about the shape and the size of the claws, as well as the dentition that I mentioned previously. The shape and size of the walking legs, and also whether or not they're hairy. They have little bristles on them. That can be pretty important. When I talk about the shape of crabs, you have to use your imagination a little bit. You have to squint to see these shapes, but these are just sort of general shapes that we sometimes talk about when we're talking about crab shape. So we talk about the shape of the crab's carapace as being fan-shaped, or teardrop-shaped, maybe square-shaped, or oblong-oval. Now, not that these are perfect geometric shapes. You don't typically see that in crabs, but the general shape is sometimes valuable. So, I would encourage everyone to get their ID guide out at this time. You should have an ID guide within your packet, maybe towards the, sort of in the middle of the packet. Now, when we send our volunteers out, we send you all out with a laminated version of this, which helps on our rainy days. But for right now, this will be really helpful. There's also a sample or an example identification sheet that looks like it has little plastic crabs and shrimp on it. You don't want that one. The one that actually has real line drawings and real photographs is our ID guide. And so I'm going to walk you through how we use our ID guide. First of all, you'll notice that it's multiple pages. And we start with the crabs on the front, and we put the European green crab right here on the top. Not because we think you're going to go out and see these every day, but because, hey, we're the Green Crab Monitoring Program. So we should probably show you what one of those looks like first. Now, all the other crabs are listed in what we think of as the likely order of abundance, or the relative abundance that we have detected them in our trapping efforts so far. So when we look at our ID guide, you'll notice that for every single one of our entries, we give you the common name that we use in our area, European green crab, as well as a code, CAMA. And that code is derived from the scientific name of the crab. Emily already shared with you that the scientific name for the green crab is Carcinus manus. So we use the first two letters from the genus name and the first two letters from the species name. And that gives us CAMA, C-A-M-A. That's important for our data collection. Now, you'll also notice that for each one of the entries in our ID guide, we use that mnemonic. clever crabs will conquer. Carapace, claws, walking legs, and then color. Okay? So, the last thing I'll mention to you about the ID guide are these yellow stars and triangles up here at the top. What we've tried to do is give you a hint, a little indication of how likely we think you are to encounter these animals in either our baited traps, that's the star there, or in our shoreline surveys as molts, and that's the triangle there. Now, what that means is if you see a bright yellow star, a bright yellow triangle, we would expect to find these crabs in the trapping surveys or the molt surveys, respectively. If you see a star or a triangle that is only partially filled in, that means there's a possibility you might encounter it. And if it's not filled in at all, it's pretty unlikely that you will run across these animals. But we want you to be aware of them just in case. So let's start with the European green crab, and you can look at your ID guide as we go through this. So the first thing about the European green crab is that the shape of the carapace and the number of marginal teeth is fairly unique for our area, which makes them pretty easy to identify if you focus on those features. As we say here, the carapace is, we like to think of this as oval, but the number of carapace teeth, there are 5. So if you start on the outside of the eye here, so there's the eye, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are 5 marginal teeth on either side. So there's 5 on this side, and there's 5 on this side. And we've counted them up over here as well. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Emily's passing around some acrylic blocks that have green crabs in them. Fortunately, these are completely harmless.
They probably won't be.
Unless you dropped it on your foot. Probably completely safe. Now, I have a freezer full of dead crabs, but I figured I wasn't going to bring those in. They smell pretty bad at this point. Now, beyond the 5 marginal teeth, there's also 3 bumps between the eyes. So the rostrum has 3 bumps. 1, 2, 3. Okay? Other things that are, I think, valuable to know, the claws are not distinctly pointy or the dentition isn't extremely pronounced like a lot of our native crabs, so they're a little bit more, we think of them as a little bit more rounded than many of our native crabs. The walking legs are fairly nondescript. I will say one of the interesting things about the European green crab is that it has slightly flattened the last parts of the appendages here, the last segments of the appendages are slightly flattened. And that's because the green crab belongs to a group of crabs called the swimming crabs, the portunids. Many of the green crab's relatives are great swimmers, like Olympic-type swimmers. They can really get up and move. The blue crab on the East Coast is a portunid. There are some other types of swimming crabs that actually spend much of their life just swimming around. All right, so that's European green crab there. Now, I said color is not a great indicator, and that's because as juveniles, they're not even green at all. Many of them are not at all green. In fact, in some habitats, especially habitats that have a lot of shell fragments, they have a color pattern that allows them to camouflage themselves quite well. So you wouldn't necessarily think of this as a green crab if you came across it. The other thing is, if you look at the carapaces in these cast-off molts, after they've been sitting around for a while, they tend to go from green to rusty brown in color. And even the live crabs can be pretty off green. In fact, the oldest male crabs, if you turn them over, oftentimes their bellies will be bright red. Pretty cool, actually. And when you cook them, they turn bright red, too. All right, so that is the European green crab. Now I'm going to move on to the crabs that you are more likely to see, and these are our native shore crabs. And this one right here, Hemigrapsis oregonensis, the hairy shore crab, is probably one of the most abundant crabs that we encounter. H-E-O-R, or the Eeyore. I think we call it Eeyore for the most part. Very, very common. So, first thing to note, this is not life size. Thankfully. That would be scary. But we've blown it up here so you can see the 3 marginal teeth. 1, 2, 3. And a sort of what we like to think of as a square-shaped carapace. So 3 marginal teeth, square-shaped carapace. They have 2 bumps between the eyes. The rostrum has 2 bumps. All right. We call this crab the hairy shore crab. Any guesses why we call it the hairy shore crab? It has extremely hairy walking legs. Very, very hairy legs. Sometimes hairier than others, but you should be able, if anytime you get a live crab in particular, you hold it up to the light, you can see these hairs. Claws are a little bit, we like to think of them as bulbous. These guys make their living like little bulldozers. They use their claws to push mud and sand around. And so, in fact, actually, it's really interesting to see these guys compete for space because they just try to plow each other over. All right, so this is the hairy shore crab.
What are the hairs for?
You know, the setae on the hairs, the hairs on the legs, most crabs have some all over their bodies, and those can be really, really small. And they use those actually to detect vibration. Many of them have chemosensory functions. The hairs on a crab are they're like little antennae. Because you imagine if you're wearing a suit of armor all the time, you need some way to feel your surroundings and interact with them. The amount of hair on these guys, I don't know why they are more hairy than their relatives. I'm not sure anyone's ever really investigated that. But that brings us to a very important point, which is its very close cousin has no hair on its walking legs. Yeah.
I understood from anecdotal evidence long
Uh-huh.
ago that Henry Grafton or Texas more at home in muddy environments than nudist.
Yeah.
And the hairs serve as a kind of filtering mechanism.
Well,
Respiration.
you know, that is a very good point, and there are certainly many crabs that use the setae, the hairs around their gill chambers as a pre-filter, so to speak. And so that is entirely possible. The interesting thing is that these guys have hairs that go all the way down to the ends of the dactyls and legs that don't have anything to do with the gill chambers. So they're just really hairy, and there probably is a variety of different reasons for that. And I can imagine that one of them might be to filter water before it goes into the gill chamber. Okay. So one of the things that we like to do is we like to put little laser cannons on our crabs. We do this because it helps us. This is, again, another little visual to help you. If you imagine that, let's go back here. If you imagine that these teeth, the 3 marginal teeth here, project more or less straight forward on this square crab. And there are also, I should also point out the deep incisions between those teeth. That if we mounted laser cannons on our crab, something we do all the time, for the kids in the back, you should know this, we mount laser cannons on the crab, and you fired those laser cannons straight forward, they would be parallel to one another. Okay, that can be valuable in thinking about identification. It'll be valuable in a second. Right now, it probably just seems weird. Yeah. This is clear as mud. Anyway, now I'm going to move on to its close relative. This is its kissing cousin, the purple shore crab, or Hinu. Now, the purple shore crab has 3 marginal teeth as well, but what we think of when we look at the purple shore crab is that it's a much more rounded carapace. And those teeth, they tend to arc in. They're also not deeply incised between the teeth. So sometimes when you run your finger along a purple shore crab's carapace, it almost feels smooth. You can just see these notches, just barely. You almost can't get a fingernail in there. Now these guys, the purple shore crab, it goes by the scientific name Hemigrapsis nudus. Anybody have any ideas why? It has no hairs. These are perfectly smooth walking legs. And if you have two of these guys side by side, it's pretty clear what the purple short crab is and what the hairy short crab is.
So it looks like you can call it either teeth or spine.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we think of it this way. We call these teeth, but then they're the tips, what we could call them, those spines primarily. So they are typically used interchangeably. The other thing I will point out is that with the claws, although the claw shape is very similar between the two short crabs, the purple short crab many times, not always, many times has purple spots. And so if you see a short crab that has purple spots on his claws, that's a pretty good indication. You're right. When you mount the laser cannons on, I made this presentation for you. Yeah, when you mount the laser cannons on this more rounded carapace, and you fire those laser cannons, they would cross. And we all know from watching Ghostbusters that you never want to cross the streets. Okay, so hairless walking legs, more rounded carapace, sometimes purple spots on the claws. You know, that is a really good question. And so there are many crabs, the short crabs will have these lumps of what amount to like they're pads of setae, the hairs. They're just lumps of fine hairs. And those pads, the purpose for those is somewhat debated, but they can use them almost like mops to mop up diatom films and algae on rocks, and they'll lick those off. There's a lot of crabs that'll do that. There's also crabs, various crab species, that have large amounts of setae on their claws to make their claws look bigger. Because one thing you probably notice if you've ever harassed a crab on the beach is that it'll stick its claws up like this. And that's a very common stereotype behavior among crabs to make themselves look bigger. And the way that crabs oftentimes interact with each other and to show dominance is by showing themselves to be really, really big. So the bigger you are, the more dominant you are. And if you can do that in a way that doesn't actually get you into a physical altercation with another crab, there's an advantage to that. Because when crabs fight, nobody wins. Well, one of the crabs eventually wins, but they might lose a claw in the process.
That's a great quote. I'm going to have that printed on it.
Yeah. All right, so if we look at our two short crabs side by side, at face value, they look pretty similar. We have 3 marginal teeth. They are similar in size, and they do overlap in habitats, although, as Bob mentioned, oftentimes the Hemigrapsis organensis, the hairy short crab, tends to occupy muddier habitats and tends to, but they do overlap. But the hairy short crab has hairy walking legs and a more square carapace. The purple short crab has no hairs on the walking legs and a more rounded carapace. And as I said, color and spotting on the claws is pretty variable. And when I say it's pretty variable, I mean it can be really, really variable. These are all hairy short crabs captured from San Juan Island. So one island, this is the variation that you see in color patterns. So pretty variable. These are all molts of purple short crabs, and you can see that if a molt's been sitting out for a while, they tend to bleach out. So don't rely on color. Now, the last thing I want to show you, and this is pretty important, this is a new slide I just put in. It's a brand new slide, I just made it in the back. Oftentimes, when we are doing our molt surveys, we don't have the whole crab. We don't have the legs. We can't tell if the legs are hairy or not because the hairy legs aren't there. There are no legs. There are no claws. All we have is the carapace. And so being able to identify these crabs by the carapace alone starts to become more valuable. So here are the 2 carapaces. I've blown them up so you can see them. And one of the things that I like to point out when we look at these is to look at the marginal teeth and look at how incised they are. Look at the space between those teeth. could you get your fingernail in there? Could you, if you ran your finger along that shell from the eye out, would your finger get hung up on it? Or do you think you'd be able to just kind of run your finger along the outside? And how much do those, how round does the carapace look? I will also point out a feature that is more or less obvious, and in this case it is pretty obvious, that on the purple shore crab, the two bumps are less well defined than on the hairy shore crab. But first, before we do that, we're going to give you a pop quiz. I'm going to show you 3 pictures of a shore crab that is green. Is it a European green crab? So get it in your mind. Is it a European green crab? Is it a purple shore crab? Or is it a hairy shore crab? You have these 3 pictures. Who thinks it's a European green crab? You fail. Who thinks it is a hairy shore crab? Okay, who thinks it's a purple shore crab? Okay, good. So, you know, what we would do is we would start here by looking at the legs, and there are no hairs on those legs. Then we would also want to look at the shape of the carapace as well, and think about how easy it would be to get your fingernail down inside that between those teeth. Also, relatively flat on the rostrum. Even though it doesn't have purple spots on the claws, because this color morph doesn't, this is kind of an oddball.
And that's square, that would, I mean,
It's more rounded than the hairy shore crab.
but generally it's considered a square carapace compared to the one.
Yeah, there's some very round carapaces out there. And just because this is a good image, I just wanted to point out, Bob, what you said. So you notice all these hairs right along this gap? That's where the entrance to the gill chamber is, right there. So all those hairs help pre-filter out the water. Anyway, what's that?
What makes them the color that they are?
Yeah, so all crabs have a certain amount of pigmentation in the shell. When they're much smaller, they actually have pigment cells within their tissues that they can actually change. So, for instance, with the very smallest crabs, like the green crab that I showed you that was multicolored, that's actually caused by pigment cells within the tissues itself. Whereas crabs, when they're bigger, like this, they just have pigment within the shell matrix. All right, so let's move on to these guys because I've been told I'm running out of time already. The Dungeness crab, these guys, many of us are familiar with them from the market when we either catch them ourselves or go and buy them as adult crabs. But in the sampling that we do, we typically come across them as much, much smaller individuals. Because crabs like this, as they get bigger, they move into deeper and deeper water. But oftentimes in pocket estuaries, that's where the little babies settle out. So pocket estuaries are a type of nursery. So the Dungeness crab. You can follow along on the ID guide here. The Dungeness crab has 10 marginal teeth starting from just outside the eye here. And these marginal teeth, there are 10 of them, and it is widest at the 10th tooth. And that's why when you actually, if you catch your own Dungeness crab, we take the sizing gauge and we stick it down into this slot right here. This makes it really handy for measuring them. Another little interesting feature is the claws. So you have 10 marginal teeth. You have a few bumps of the rostrum. I think we indicate that there's 3, right? Oh, we don't even indicate there because it's kind of variable. Anyway, relatively small rostrum, and I'll come back to that in a second. But 10 marginal teeth with the widest being the 10th tooth is very, very important for identification. Claws, they tend to be pretty pointy, and we have serrations or dentition on the inside, but also on the upper surface, strangely. I don't know why that's like that. But they have teeth on the outside as well as on the inside. Okay. Some hairiness to the legs, but the reason I point these things out is to differentiate the Dungeness crab from its very close cousin, which many of us don't even know is out there, They don't reach market size. They don't reach a size at which they can be harvested commercially. And so most people don't even pay that much attention to graceful crab. But they're very, very similar in many characteristics. So here is the graceful crab. It also has 10 marginal teeth, but interestingly, it is widest at the 9th tooth, not the 10th tooth. And I'll show you an up-close version of this, but the way that we find that 10th tooth is just a little tiny notch. Now also, the claws, the upper surface of the claw is smooth. There is no teeth on it. And they tend to have much less hairy legs. I mean, I don't know if I would go so far as to say they're hairless, but they don't have the amount of hair that the Dungeness do. Oh, there's that notch I was talking about. So when I compare them side by side, Dungeness and graceful, at the same size. These are both juvenile to subadult crabs. They look pretty similar. I mean, I'm with you here. They look very, very similar. But if we zoom in on them and we look at them more closely, just from the carapace alone, we see that it's smooth back here and widest at this point. On the graceful crab, you see this little notch, and it's widest at this point. And if we counted from the front, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Whereas with this guy, it's widest at the 10th. That is the best way to tell those crabs apart, particularly if you're just working with the carapace. But if you're working with a whole crab, you can look at that, the teeth on the upper surface of the claw as well. Now, I mentioned that we have the graceful crab and the Dungeness crab, and they are cousins. Well, this guy is the third cousin twice removed, the red rock crab, a relative, but a more distant relative. Red rock crab, we expect this to be a nice big red crab. That's not always the case, especially when they're smaller. So I'm going to walk you through some of the features of this guy. So first of all, red rock crabs, we think of their carapace as being much more fan-shaped. They tend to be a lot wider than their cousins. They also have 5 bumps to the rostrum, and this rostrum protrudes beyond the eye. So there's the eye there, so this rostrum sticks out. They have black tips to the claws. That's a pigmentation in the claw itself that actually increases the strength of the shell. That's very important because red rock crabs spend their time crushing really, really strong things, really heavily shelled things like moon snails and clams. This is the business end you don't want to stick your finger in. Also notice the dentition, much more like molars for crushing. Now, the marginal teeth, there are 10, but the first 2 are fused together, which gives it this sort of wide look. And the teeth overall are more bulbous. They're slightly more rounded. I think they look more like actual teeth, to be quite honest. The other thing I will point out is that, where the graceful crab and the Dungeness are either widest at the 9th or the 10th tooth, the rock crab, because of its shape, you can't really tell which one's wider. I mean, it kind of almost flattens out here on the end. So when we look at these guys, first of all, I just want to get through color real quick. Red rock crab, not always red, especially when they're smaller. Lots of different color morphs. These are all juveniles here, very small crabs. You'd still see that shelf-like projection of the rostrum, the 5 bumps, but even though the color is pretty variable. Really, really variable in some cases. I mean, from orange and white all the way to this zebra pattern. When I say small individuals, I'm talking about really small crabs for the most part. But these are the kinds that we would get in our traps, and sometimes we see in our molt surveys. Took another image in the back of the room while Emily was talking, and I wanted to put this in here. This is the carapace from these 3 related, we call them the cancrid crabs. They're all related cancer-type crabs. The graceful crab here, the Dungeness here, and the red rock here, just to give you a sense when you look at all three of these side by side, you know, with the graceful crab and the Dungeness, it's that the prominence of the 10th tooth. Here it's relatively small and it's widest of the 9th tooth. Here, very prominent 10th tooth. That's a good way to differentiate those two. With the red rock crab, being able to tell which one of these teeth sticks out farthest is usually pretty tricky. We have this well-developed rostrum here as well. Okay, so we will just take, right, so a couple of other crabs that we see as well. This is the hairy helmet crab. We're moving on to the backside. The hairy helmet crab, if you note the triangle and star nomenclature that we've used so far, you'll notice that we don't expect to see these in baited traps at all. We've never caught one in a baited trap. I've never personally caught one in a baited trap, but we do sometimes see their molts in our shore surveys. And I point them out as well because during past green crab monitoring efforts, this is the crab that most often gets confused with the European green crab. And it's because it just looks a little odd. I mean, it's a little green, but it's also a little bit different than what many of us expect to see in terms of a crab. It's not exactly your most stereotypical crab shape. We like to think of this as a diamond-shaped carapace. They have some fairly jagged marginal teeth, and they're widest at the fifth. And it is the hairy helmet crab, and we call it the hairy helmet crab because it's very hairy. And in fact, you all have a carapace for a hairy helmet crab there, and you can just feel that carapace and feel how rough it is, and that's because of all the hairs on that carapace. They have very small claws that are almost indistinct from the walking legs. The walking legs are extremely long. This is probably the fastest crab we have in our local waters. If you encounter one of these guys in an eelgrass bed, they'll just take off running. Sometimes they look, when they're alive, they look like this, or they might actually look like they're covered in sand, and that's because the hairy, the little hairs on the carapace will actually pick up a lot of debris. Okay, so that is the hairy helmet crab, Tech. And as I said, we most often see them just as molted exoskeleton, the carapace. Now, they are sometimes confused with spider crabs, like our local kelp crabs, but the way that we tell them apart is that, first of all, note that the rostrum on this guy is relatively small, doesn't really protrude too far, and it is actually just about as wide as it is long in the body. Now that contrasts with spider crabs, which are typically much longer in the body than they are wide, and they most often have a large rostrum that sticks well beyond the eye. So here's a couple of additional images. These are our local kelp crabs. I mean, they're called spider crabs because of their long spidery legs. But you see the rostrum sticking out well beyond the eye, and they are longer than they are wide. Now, we don't use marginal teeth on the carapace to identify these guys because marginal teeth are highly variable across spider crabs. These are spider crabs all along the west coast of the U.S. We don't have all these varieties here, but it is pretty variable. I'm only pointing out the spider crabs because we occasionally may find them as molts. We'll never catch them in a baited trap as a live animal. There are some molts of kelp crabs on your trays, and you can differentiate those from the helmet crabs because for the most part they're smooth, but also look at that rostrum. It's very well defined and sticks out way beyond the eye in the case of the spider crab. Okay. Move on to the hermit crabs, because the hermit crabs, actually we do encounter these guys in our traps on occasion. The two that we come across are the hairy hermit crab and the grainy-handed hermit crab. Here they are side by side. we call the hairy hermit crab a hairy hermit crab because it's got hairy legs. It's got hairy white banded legs, and it actually has bands on the antenna as well. The grainy-handed hermit crab, we call it the grainy-handed hermit crab because it has grainy hands. It has little tubercles on its claws that look like little blue sand grains almost. But what I think is actually an even easier way to tell these hermit crabs apart is with their behavior. If you come across a hairy hermit crab, they most often are in shells that are much too small for their bodies. So if you pick up a hairy hermit crab, it won't be able to retract all the way into its shell. And in fact, if you pick it up by the shell, it might just leave the shell behind and take off running. They don't use their shells to defend their bodies in quite the same way that other hermit crabs might. Like the grainy-handed hermit crab, which most often occupies a shell that is much too large for its body. And just like this little female here, if it wants to, it'll tuck all the way in. So these guys oftentimes get taken home by mistake at the beach because somebody finds a pretty shell and decides to take it home, and then when they get home, they find that it's being occupied. So those are the two hermits. We have lots of other hermits in our area, but these are the only two that we are likely to encounter in a pocket estuary. Yeah, white-banded hairy legs, and then the blue tubercles on the legs and the claws. Lots of other much less common crabs, and I think also burrowing shrimp, that are in your ID guide. I'm not even going to go through those here, but at your leisure, take a look. We will also put a much more thorough description of all these species online as a video for you, and we'll send that link out. I think we have to update it a little bit. Shrimp. I'm going to move on to shrimp just very, very briefly. And I just want to point out that shrimp are essentially just crabs that have been stretched out. They have all the same body parts. We have a carapace. We have an abdomen. In a crab, the abdomen is folded under the body. In a shrimp, it sticks out. It's what we make our shrimp cocktail out of. They have a rostrum, oftentimes long and pointy and pokey. They have antennae, typically much longer than the antennae on a crab. Walking legs as well as a claw. The claw is typically pretty small. Now, really the only shrimp that we have encountered in our trapping effort thus far is the sand shrimp. The sand shrimp, they call it the sand shrimp because it likes to hang out in the sand and mud. And you probably, as you've been walking across a mud flat anywhere, you probably stepped on hundreds of these guys because they blend in really, really well. The only time we encounter them is when they're actually in the baited trap that we see them. They bury themselves up to the level of their eyeballs, and they're lie-in-wait predators that they just wait for an opportunity to spring out and grab anything that's going by, and they use their really interesting subchelate claw to snag it. Fortunately, these guys are very small. If they were big, I'd be worried, but the subchelate claw is a really good distinguishing feature on the sand shrimp. They tend to have a body that's also kind of flattened. It's good for hiding in the sand. That's the only shrimp that I'm going to show you today. The ID guide, I think, has one other type as well as burrowing shrimp. But as I said, we don't expect to encounter those. And in fact, we haven't encountered any other shrimp in any of our efforts so far. Okay, so yeah, one thing I would like to point out, and Emily will cover this later, is that if you come across something that you can't identify, we are more than happy to receive photographs of those items, and we're more than happy to help you with any sort of ID. There'll be more opportunities when we go out in the field to go over some of these things. Fish, I'm going to cover a few, but first some nomenclature here. The dorsal fin, that on the upper surface of the fish. The caudal fin is the tail fin. Anal fin, where you might expect an anal fin to be. The pectoral fin are those fins on the side. And the pelvic fin is on the belly. The operculum is the gill cover. Those are important features. Because when we identify, probably the most common fish that we encounter in our traps is the staghorn sculpin. Staghorn sculpin has a relatively flattened body and a really big head. Sometimes they're called bullheads around here. Anybody who's done any sort of plunk fishing from the shore in particular, you probably, as a kid, we used to catch these things like crazy. What we call them the staghorn sculpin because of the large antler-like spines on their gill covers. They also have lobe-like pectoral fins, but I'm going to show you here. Here's an image where this particular staghorn sculpin has he's been agitated and he's sticking up those antler-like spines on his gill covers. You've got to watch out for these things. They'll hang you up for sure, a finger or a glove or anything. And they use them for protection. Obviously, it's really great if somebody's trying to swallow you whole to stick those things out and stop them in their tracks. Here's a head-on version, so you can see those antler-like spines. This guy is agitated. He's compressing the musculature in his head, which is causing those gill covers to shoot up like this. And I think somebody's finger is getting skewered there. But you can see those projections. And then, like I said, those lobe-like pectoral fins with the striping. Okay. Now you might get this guy, or you might get a relative. This is another type of sculpin. This is the tide pool sculpin. Now the tide pool sculpin, it does have a relatively large head and a slender body, but it has 5 saddle-like patches that go down the body. It also only has a very, very small spine on the gill cover, not anything that you would actually poke yourself on, to be honest. The pectoral fins are also not nearly as lobe-like and striped. So here's just a couple of other variations. I will say that although the head is large, the head on a staghorn sculpin tends to be more rounded. These guys tend to have a more pointy snout. These guys also have the interesting behavior when we catch them and we put them into our trays. They coil their tails up. Not always, but they often do. And Emily will show you some images of that in a little bit. So moving on from the sculpin, the shiner perch. This is a deep-bodied, silvery fish. We like to think of it as football-shaped. And it's oftentimes has silver sides, but it has 3 yellow stripes along the body. So here's another one here. So football-shaped, 3 yellow stripes. Here's another silvery fish. This one is more cigar-shaped. It's longer in the body, not football-shaped at all. The 3-spine stickleback, we call it that because it has 3 spines on its dorsal surface. It also has a pelvic spine here. And again, they use these for defense. You've got to watch out for them when you're handling them or moving them around. They'll get caught in a net.
So do those stay up all the time, or are they just freaked out?
He's just freaked out. Yeah, he's just freaked. And that's a really good point. It actually gets me to my next picture, which is what they oftentimes look like is when they have those spines laid down, you don't really even see them. So you'd have to really, you could differentiate this guy from the football-shaped shiner perch, and if you just sort of moved your finger back and forth on that dorsal surface, you'd be able to feel those spines. But chances are if you tried to poke him with your finger, you'd see those spines pretty quickly. So this is the 3-spine stickleback, much more elongated than the shiner perch and doesn't have those 3 yellow bars. Now, in the past, we have treated all flatfish as just flat fish, and we can tell a flatfish from other fish because they're flat. For a scientist, that's a flat fish. But we have gone to differentiating out one type of flatfish, and that's the starry flounder. The starry flounder is one that we have caught repeatedly at our sites, and it's one that we can differentiate from the others fairly easily by its color pattern. So this is the starry flounder here. Interestingly, it can be either right-eyed or left-eyed, meaning it can lay on either the right side of its body or the left side of its body. It tends to have tubercles on its head, and then it also has these stripes on the fins. Here's the head, the left-eyed and the left-eyed and the right-eyed form, and you can see those lumps on the head. Here's the underside of the body. So again, you turn one of these guys over, it's really easy to tell them apart from any other type of flatfish. They have a very pale body with these striped fins. And if you don't see those, then you have a flatfish. If you see those, you have a starry flounder. That's as far as we ask you all to go, because getting into flatfish ID that's really getting into the weeds. And I think I'm going to leave it at that, other than to just show you a picture of eel-like fishes. In the past, we have gone through IDs on the eel-like fishes, but we haven't actually captured any eel-like fishes in our baited traps. So I'm going to just exclude that for now. But I think it is still included in the ID guide, or maybe not. At least we go through it in more detail. The eel-like fishes in the online tutorial. Okay, that's all I have for you right now.
Yeah, I'd love to make sure we get to lunch before it gets too late. If you
Yeah.
do have questions for us, we're going to be sticking around and able to answer them over lunch. There's also a lot of specimens in the back. You can quiz yourself after you finish your sandwich or whatever. I'd still like to try to reconvene in 20 minutes. I realize it's a bit tight, but you can continue to eat while I start on the next portion, just to make sure that we get everybody home on time. Does that sound agreeable? Okay, great.
Yeah, and if you have any questions about ID, I'm willing to answer those now too.
Sean will give you his cell phone number. Call him at 4 in the morning.
This is an emergency crowd question.
Emergency crowd.
You never know when you're going to come up with one of those.